What's up, everybody? Mr. Smythe here with yet another super awesome, amazing review session for the AP exam. Lots of people watching. All right, picking up where we left off yesterday, we're talking about European national unification, different countries in Europe becoming countries. So I'm going to pick up with the Crimean War. All right. Basically, what happens here at this point, like we talked about, there's been 50 years of peace throughout Europe as a result of the Concert of Europe, as a result of kind of the end of the Napoleonic era, focusing on balance of power. And that kind of ends here with the Crimean War. So we have the Ottoman Empire, which owns this territory in Europe. We talked about there's a dispute that happens over kind of religious privileges and what different religious groups are permitted to do within the Ottoman Empire and what other religious groups are not permitted to do. The Ottoman Empire, due to external pressure from France, decides to extend different privileges to Roman Catholics, but not extend those same privileges to Orthodox Christians, particularly in Jerusalem, which is a problem for Russia. And as a result, nationalism spreads throughout many of the people in this region. They decide that they want to seek their own independence so that they can have their own, religious freedom. And they begin to push back on their Ottoman rulers. And this ultimately results in initially an unsuccessful revolt, rebellion, whatever you want to call it, by these individuals in this part of the world. But eventually they are successful, and they are successful as a result of their the support that they get from France and Russia, who both support these groups, not because they want them to be independent. In fact, they are going to actually turn around and try and snatch them up. But it's mainly because they want to destabilize the Ottoman Empire. And that's basically what happens here with the Crimean Wars. It is a show to the rest of Europe and the world that the Ottoman Empire is crumbling, right? It's humiliating for them. And also for Russia. We also then get the period of Italian unification. So Italy at this point, during the industrial age and kind of immediate post-industrial revolution, is not a country. Italy and Germany are both a collection of independent states. They all share the same culture, religion, language, etc., but they're not one unified nation. So no one at this point is considering themselves to be Italian. We have a group that forms in Italy at this time known as Young Italy, which is a group of organized around the idea of Italian unification and led by a guy by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini. And they kind of rise up and push for Italian unification. Ultimately, they're not successful, but the result of that movement is the concept of Italian unification. And Italians come away with that experience with an understanding that if they want to be successful in unifying Italy, that they're going to need help from external sources. We then get the unification movement that starts in northern Italy, and it's going to spread throughout the peninsula. Starts in northern Italy with a guy by the name of Count Cavour, who becomes the prime minister of the Piedmont territory, which is today part of Italy. And his focus is on unifying all of Italy. He's going to build up Piedmont's national economy and their military, making it an attractive ally for the rest of the Italian states. He's going to reach out to Napoleon III in France and ask for his help in freeing northern Italy from Austria. He promises in return for their assistance that he's going to give sections of northern Italy to France in return for their assistance in getting rid of Austria. Napoleon III in France agrees. Although they don't really deliver or live up to their promise. And so when northern Italy breaks free of Austrian rule, Count Cavour is going to kind of turn his back on Napoleon III in France because they essentially failed to live up to their promises. And so that's going to result in a break really from Austria and France. And so we're going to end up with an independent and unified northern Italy. Now, for southern Italy, we have a similar situation where it's a cohort of Italian states, and this is where this guy Giuseppe Garibaldi comes into play. He's an Italian military leader who previously had been exiled to Latin America, but he returns in southern Italy with the idea of unifying southern Italy and kind of creating one Italy. He leads an armed rebellion against the Bourbon king of Sicily. He raises an army. They're all wearing red uniforms, and so they get the nickname the Red Shirts. He's successful in unifying all of southern Italy, which he then turns over to the leader of northern Italy at the time, Victor Emmanuel II, and that results in one unified Italian state with the exception of Rome. Red Shirts, so they're successful, and we unify then all of Italy at that point under one national banner, with the exception at that time of Rome, which was under the control of still of France. Now, Italy gets a huge break during what's called the Franco-Prussian War, which we'll talk more about when we talk about France and Germany. During the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III is at war with Prussia, and he needs the bulk of his army to be focused on that because Prussia has, even though it's a very small state in comparison to France, it has the best land-based military in France at that time. So he's going to pull his resources out of Rome to facilitate the conflict with Prussia. And when they leave Rome, it obviously opens Rome up to be, join the Italian rebellion. At that point, we get an entirely unified peninsula of Italy. We get the Italian state. That brings us to our next European piece of European unification, and that's Germany. So Germany, just like Italy, is not a country at this point. It's a collection of separate German states. We're sharing language, culture, religion, etc. Prussia is the preeminent German state at this time, most powerful, most successful, etc. The leader of Prussia at this time is a guy by the name of Otto von Bismarck. Huge name. Should set off all kinds of bells when you hear it. Bismarck's involved in a number of important moments during this period in European history. Bismarck's the guy that develops the idea known as Realpolitik, a method of political maneuvering that sought practical results. So basically what that means is instead of asking what is right, what is moral or ethical, it is asking which action is the best to get what you want as a state or an individual. It's very Machiavellian. So there's a nice connection, Machiavelli and Bismarck, right? Machiavelli and Realpolitik, right? Bismarck begins building up his military even more than previously. So we're going to make Prussia just the end all be all. And there's a number of different events that allow Prussia to unify Germany, right? So Bismarck understands that he's not going to be able to unify Germany unless he basically gets the Germans to want to unify. How is he going to do that? Well, it's simple. If you give everyone in Germany that's separate, all these separate states, a common enemy, they're going to come together, out of emotionally and practically. So the first event is the Prussian-Danish War. There are two German provinces where the people share German culture and German language and everything, but they're controlled by Denmark. Bismarck reaches out to Austria and seeks their assistance in freeing those provinces from Denmark, and in return, he's offering them one of the two provinces. So, hey, Austria, if you help me free these provinces up from Denmark, you get one, I get one, right? But that's what he says to them. What does he really know? Because Bismarck is like a master tactician or manipulator. He's playing 3D chess here. What's his real intention? It's that he knows that Austria, with Austria's help, he can get those two provinces away from Denmark. And then he's going to have one German state, which will be then controlled by Austria, which then he can unify all of Germany against Austria and get that piece back, thus bringing both of these provinces into German control, expanding German territory, but also, right, unifying Germany against the other. And that's basically how that plays out. That leads to the Austrian-Prussian War in 1866, also known as the 7 Weeks War, where prior to the start of the war, Bismarck goes around. And again, he's a genius, right? So not only is he setting Austria up into this conflict, and again, increasing his territory, increasing German unification, but he also goes a step further. And what he's going to do is go around to the other European nations prior to this conflict, and he's going to have them sign non-intervention treaties. So basically ensuring that his conflict is just 1v1, right? It's Prussia versus Austria. I don't need everybody else getting involved, right? As a result of the conflict, many of the provinces turn towards Prussia away from Austria, but not all of the territory, which results in the need for another conflict, and that is the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, which is the best way to unify the German states. There's no legitimate reason for this conflict, so Bismarck invents one, right? He knows he needs another conflict to further unify all of the German states under one flag. And, you know, he's not able to kind of lure anyone this time into a conflict because he's done it twice already, and the rest of Europe kind of gets picked up on his playbook. So he's basically just going to invent one. He falsifies a telegram, which he sends from a Prussian diplomat to a French diplomat. In the telegram, the Prussian diplomat is insulting Napoleon III, right? This is genius, right? He knows that Napoleon III is going to freak out when he sees this, which he then leaks this telegram to the press in France. Napoleon III does see it, and of course, he freaks out. As a result, Napoleon III declares war on Prussia, and because it's France now, which is a pretty legitimate threat, all of the German states unify and rally in support of Prussia. Boom, bam, bing. At the end of that war, right, Germany unifies, becomes a German state, and crowns a German king for the first time, who is known as Kaiser Wilhelm I. All right. This also leads to other political effects throughout Europe, mainly the formation of European alliances. Okay, we get two general alliances, which are going to be the basis not just for this period of European history, but are going to lead us right into World War I. Those are the Triple Alliance, where Bismarck serves as Chancellor of Germany from 1871 to 1890. And his policies as prime minister are going to be solely focused on isolating France, who he believes is the #1 threat to the German state. So he's going to create a number of alliances with other European states, assuming there's going to be another great war with France in the near future. In 1882, he creates what's known as the Triple Alliance. Now, right here, let's pause, because this is where things get a little confusing. During this period and what will become World War I, Germany is on the side of what's called the Triple Alliance. Again, where that's confusing is in World War II, Germany will then be on the side of the Axis powers, not the Allied powers. So it's the converse, right? In World War I, in this period and leading up to and during World War I, Germany is going to be on the Triple Alliance side. Okay. And Bismarck creates that. It's an alliance between Germany, Italy, and Austria, which supports existing political orders in these states, and it's a mutual defense pact against France specifically. Now, France sees this, and we'll learn more about this later on. France sees what's going on with Germany and Austria and sees them as threats, and France begins to realize that they need allies in Europe to protect themselves, because a lot of Europe is kind of aligning against them. And so France is going to form an alliance with Great Britain and eventually Russia in 1907 in response to Bismarck's Triple Alliance. Now, how this happens, how they get Great Britain to agree to an alliance with them when they've been fighting each other for hundreds of years, we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about the period of imperialization. But for right now, Triple Alliance, triple entente. Then we get the Balkans War. And this is another example of the spread of nationalism. What is the Balkans War? It's a nationalistic uprising which begins to take place in the Balkans, where people where people of various Balkan nations want to establish their own states in line with their own national identities, thus breaking free from Austrian and Ottoman control, because the Balkans was split up between the Ottoman Empire and Austria. So we get the First and Second Balkans War. The various states of the Balkans call on their European allies to help them gain their independence. These regional conflicts result in the cementing of divisions between these European nations. So it's the first kind of like proxy war that cements this split of Europe between the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Okay. Now, this brings us to the period of European imperialism, which is 1815 to 1914. And it's important to understand imperialism exists prior to this period, right? We talked about imperialism during the Age of Exploration, right? But this is a different flavor of imperialism. And so it's often referred to as new imperialism. And new imperialism has a couple of different strategies, techniques, or ways that it's implemented. The first one is what's called economic imperialism, something that still goes on today, okay? And that is after the period of industrialization, there's a strong motivation to imperialize other parts of the globe to gain access to more raw materials and new markets for manufactured goods. So basically, Europe's industrialized, but in order to continue to produce on the scale that they've established, that they've built their states and their economies around, they require a massive influx of raw materials, things that they can take in and produce into manufactured goods. And then they need a place to sell those manufactured goods. And what they've kind of learned by this point is their best idea is to sell these things in a colonial or imperial empire, because you can demand or force your colonial or imperial counterparts to buy only your manufactured goods, right? Which we'll see isn't the best economic system, but it's the best idea they have at this time. So there's this mad dash to increase your imperial or colonial holdings throughout the world, right? The example of this is the British imperialism of China. And this is where Vermeer's hat, am I saying that right? Vermeer. This is where his hat comes into play. This is finally, we read it in the summer. It's now April 25th, and it's coming into play. Okay. Thank God you guys read that awesome book. I thought that was it's about British imperialization of China, isn't it?
It's about all of that. It's from.
I didn't read it. So I read your essays. That was earlier. Mostly there was only like 2 pages on opium. Okay. I didn't read the book. Yeah. I didn't read it. Well, as Tristan says, it does mention the opium war. So, okay, Tristan, I know you know I didn't read it. Thank you. Okay. I didn't assign it, so I didn't have to read it. This is the British imperialism of China. The British are buying tea from China, right? Now, basic economics today, but certainly during this period, is you want more money coming in than money going in, right? And at this point, when Great Britain is buying tea from China by the boatload, China is not interested in buying any of Great Britain's manufactured goods. So they're spending a lot of money in China on tea, and they're not recouping any of it. So they have a lot of currency, they have a lot of wealth leaving their country, going into China, and nothing coming back. That's not a good situation. So they decide that they have to, right, basically create a situation. They want to keep buying the tea from China. They have to create a situation where China becomes dependent on them for something. And their solution, which is very nefarious, is opium, which is a drug derived from the poppy plant. And what's interesting is today, a lot of people associate opium, the poppy plant, in Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East. It actually originates in India, which at this time is a British colony. So Great Britain starts to ship opium into China, and it quickly spreads. A lot of Chinese people get addicted to opium. And now Great Britain has that kind of in and out, give and take economic exchange, right? They're buying the tea, but they're recouping their wealth in the opium trade. China, understandably, doesn't love the fact that the British are basically getting them hooked on drugs and importing large quantities of drugs into their country. across their border. So they decide that they're going to put up a wall. No, but as a joke. So China decides that they want to stop the importation of opium into their country. This results in a little bit of a naval conflict. Unfortunately for China, they're in absolutely no position to do anything about the British fleet, which is by and far the most dominant naval power in the world at this time. And so, since they can't stop the importation of opium because they're not industrialized and they just can't compete, we get what's called the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, where the British are given control of Hong Kong for the next 150 years, leading us right to a potential conflict and a lot of political issues in our modern world. There's the connection, right? And China is forced also to open 5 trade ports to the British, right? So basically the British, right? This is an example of new imperialism, right? Using economics, using goods to facilitate, right, imperial and or colonial control, right? Indirect, right? Another example of this, and a huge part of this story in this period is the European imperialism of Africa, right? And we call this the scramble for Africa. Basically, as we know from the age of imperialism, Europeans have been in Africa for a long time by this point, right? Portugal set up colonies and explored Africa hundreds of years ago, right? We've also had the European slave trade, which by this point is done, but it's Europe in Africa is nothing new. The difference now is what the European focus on what they want to get out of Africa is, right? Previously, it was slaves, it was gold, right? It was wealth, it was what can we take, right? Now it's going to be the natural resources, the raw materials that exist in Africa, and getting kind of colonial control deep within the continent, right? And everybody's going to want in on it because it's a vast market and there's a lot of very valuable natural resources that are located in Africa, okay? It's not quite economic imperialism. This is more a period or an example of imperialism done by force, and it's not indirect, it's direct. Otto von Bismarck, this is where he comes into play again. So Bismarck, again, Prime Minister of Germany at this time, and he sees the road that we're headed towards in Europe with the scramble for Africa. He realizes that as all of the European nations dump their focus into grabbing as much of Africa as they can, it's going to lead to a European conflict, right? Because we're going to start to step on each other's toes and argue over who owns what. And so to avoid this, right, because we want to keep business as usual, we want to keep things stable, he calls what's called the Berlin Conference in 1884, which is going to last from 1884 to 1885. And this is where the European nations sit down and they're going to basically divvy up Africa peacefully and set a system of rules so that everyone is able to get what they want, do what they want without having conflict amongst each other. Obviously, the one group of people that's not invited to the Berlin conference is anyone from Africa, right? So we're going to decide how Africa is divided without asking any Africans. The results of the Berlin conference, we set up the rules for the game, so to speak, of the conquest of Africa. As I mentioned, Africans are not involved. We vastly increased the imperialism of Africa by Europe, right? Countries that have control over the coast are going to be the first ones to colonize the interior of Africa. And in order to take possession of the interior of Africa, European nations are going to have to send Europeans to physically go there and establish and maintain their spheres of influence and control, right? So you can't do it just by name and say, hey, that's ours. You have to actually have people on the ground to kind of establish where the lines begin and end. Okay. This brings us to another major factor in this age of imperialism, which is the different motivations for imperialism. And the first one being racial superiority. This is where, and this is, so this whole concept of racism and the superiority amongst races is not something that's existed. Obviously, there have been disputes that we've talked about throughout European history to this point. But if you notice, it's very rarely been based on race or ethnicity. A lot of it's been based on religion. But again, as we said when we talked about isms, we've kind of separated ourselves from religion being the sole deciding, determining factor for everything we do in Europe from this point forward. And now we're going to get into racial motivations and racial conflict. And a lot of this is tied back to a guy by the name of Charles Darwin, who most of us know. He's a guy who studies animal and plant development and creates a theory of evolution through what's called natural selection, which concludes that species on Earth have developed over time through adaptation to their environment. Species develop due to natural selection, not religious design. Again, we're separating ourselves from the dominance of religion. This led to what's called organic evolution, which is the belief that the better adapted a species becomes, the more it will flourish and reproduce in its environment, right? Which in turn coins the phrase survival of the fittest, okay? Darwin later applies this theory to human development and believes that humans descended from a common ancestor and evolved to our modern form over time. Now, that's the scientific part of this whole thing. Where this becomes a problem in terms of like what we're talking about, where it really explodes, is when Darwin's work and scientific theories are applied to society and politics and ethnicities and races. And that is called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is an offshoot of Darwin's theory of evolution, and it's created by a guy by the name of Herbert Spencer. He's a British philosopher who takes Darwin's theories and applies them to human racial diversity and social development, arguing that if all life is guided by Darwin's principles, then there must be superior races, superior cultures, and superior societies. Because again, Darwin's theory alleges that that evolution leads to superiority, right? That species, the more adapt they are to their environment, they become superior and thus they flourish. Well, Spencer's connecting this to society, meaning that the more developed a society is, the more adapted it is to its environment, the more it makes use of its environment, then it's superior to other civilizations or societies that haven't done that, right? Because they're able to flourish. And so really what this relates to is Western society, right? Because Western society has industrialized, therefore made better use of its environment. Therefore, those people must be superior to other peoples throughout the world who have not industrialized. Now, obviously, we know today this has kind of been disproven because it's not taking into account geographic factors and a multitude of other reasons which lead any society to industrialize. We also get a guy by the name of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who furthers Spencer's work and argues that Germans were descendants of the Aryan race, which is the purest form of human being, and thus the German people were the purest and therefore the most superior of the human race. He also argues that the German people, being the purest form of humanity, must prepare themselves to fight against racial mixing from other groups like Jews, Africans, etc. Now, this probably sounds familiar, even though we haven't gotten to it yet, because Hitler is going to pick this up and run with it, right? But more on that later. After contrasting the wealth and power that industrial nations in Europe have accumulated with the relative poverty of many of the places in Africa, many Europeans conclude that Western nations are in fact superior, right? They're superior. Why? Because they've developed a superior civilization, right? Again, you're looking at the end and you're not considering all the variables, and we're almost looking for a result that will confirm a theory that we want confirmed, right? It's bad science, it's bad theory, it's bad reason. But you see how they make this connection, right? And so this is embodied in a really influential work, which is called The White Man's Burden, which is it's a poem written by, I thought it was Richard Kipling. It's Rudyard Kipling.
You spelled it right. It's Rudyard Kipling. I promise that's right.
I spelled it right. Can you say that again?
You actually spelled something right for once.
Thank you. No comment. Kipling is important. Kipling's the guy who writes this poem, and it's centered around the idea of Western superiority. And what's important is he doesn't just articulate the fact that Western society is superior. He furthers the belief that because they're superior, it's Western society's obligation So it's not just a justification for imperialism and colonialism of Africa and indigenous peoples. It's their obligation, meaning it's not that they can do it, it's that they have to and should do it, right? So it's their job to colonize and imperialize the world because they are the superior civilization on Earth, right? That's the white man's burden, and that is the furthest embodiment of Darwin's theory of evolution and social Darwinism. So what allows these Western societies, we have their motivation, right? We have their belief, their justification, but what allows them to actually do this stuff? How are they able to do it? Well, there are a number of factors that lead to their ability to dominate indigenous populations, right? First is they have superior military technology. This is the beginning of modern weapons used in combat. Obviously, World War I is going to be kind of the first war where they're really used, but this is predating that, where some of the tools that are used in World War I, some of the weapons technology is going to be first unveiled. We have things like the breech loading gun, right? Rifles, rifling, the cartridge, right? Bullets, modern ammunition, which is going to dramatically change and dramatically increase the firepower of firearms, right? And that's not even taking into account the invention of the machine gun, which, I mean, you know, if you know what a machine gun is, which everyone pretty much does, you can imagine how ridiculously effective that would be on the battlefield when your opponent doesn't have one, right? And doesn't even understand what it is. We also have the advancements in communication and transportation technology. We talked about the telegraph previously, but again, it allows for, it's not just the telegraph, it's the technological innovation that allows the cables to run not just at great length, but underwater, which allows for the streamline of instant communication throughout a colonial or imperial empire. And then finally, the massive building of railroads, right? Railroad infrastructure, allowing the mass and efficient transportation of raw materials and manufactured goods to be transported around the colonies at speed. Another example of this is the Suez Canal, which is developed at this time, and it offers the ability for Europeans to transport goods by ship faster and more efficiently by sailing through in the canal instead of around Africa. We also get advancements in medical technology. One of the big barriers to European conquest of the African continent prior to this period is malaria. Malaria is a disease which has been catastrophic for Europeans prior to this period, but now we have not just medication to treat malaria, but with Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister, we get the invention of vaccination. So we have the medicine, we have the idea of vaccination. So now we can send Europeans into the continent and they will be unaffected by diseases like malaria. So what are the global effects of imperialism? Well, there's a couple different things. The first effect is diplomatic tensions, right? And so this is where we start to lead towards World War I. So again, we're talking about a period, a substantial period of peace throughout the continent of Europe. Everyone's kind of focused on that, right? During this period of industrialization and imperialization, we have all the different powers of Europe. They're squabbling and they're scrounging to increase their power, their wealth, right? They're in competition, but at the same time that they're in competition, there's this heavy focus on, hey, we want the competition, we need the competition, but we don't want the conflict. And so they're making all of these maneuvers in the short term, right? Which allows them to increase their wealth and power and achieve their goals, but in the short term is preventing, you know, direct conflict as a result of this competition. The problem is in the short term it's going to work, but they're going to draw so many lines in creating so many diplomatic solutions and alliances that it's going to create tension, which ultimately in the long term is going to create this massively problematic situation, which will be World War I. An example of this is I can't say this word, Fashida crisis. This is a problem where we have Great Britain and France. So this goes back to that triple entente that we talked about, the alliance between Great Britain and France. Great Britain and France are in Africa. They have two kind of colonial powers that they developed, and they want to connect each other and really all of that part of Africa with railway systems. Both nations are building railways, and now the argument comes over who's going to control the nexus, which is in the Sudan, which neither of them has claim to. So it's this independent area between the two, the Sudan. And so they start fighting over who's going to get control over the Sudan and thus control this nexus of railway systems, because that would be very lead to an increase in power and wealth. Both France and Great Britain pour in military resources to get control over the Sudan. France quickly realizes they're no match for the British military might. They're outmanned and outgunned. But really, in a stroke of genius, France also sees that by conceding this crisis to Great Britain, they can improve and rebuild their relationship with Great Britain, which they need to do because, again, they're realizing that Germany is aligning against them with Austria and Italy. And so France decides to concede this to Great Britain, which improves their relationship and leads to the Entente Cordiale, which is the precursor to the Triple Entente, which is an agreement of friendly relations between the two nations, which had previously fought each other for hundreds of years. And again, that's ultimately going to lead to a formal military alliance between the British and the French for the first time in European history. They're going to be aligned against basically the rest of Europe. Later, Russia will join them, and that basically gives us one side of the two sides of World War I. Another thing that develops as a result of this period is growing opposition to imperialism in Europe. So for most people, for most Europeans, they're on board with this whole imperialism thing, right? We talked about social Darwinism. So they like the benefits to it for the people in Europe. It's making them insanely rich. It's bettering the quality of life for Europe. And oh, by the way, they have the scientific justification for this behavior. But some people are starting to question it because it's pretty ruthless and unfair for the indigenous population. And so this criticism and questioning of imperialism starts to pop up throughout Europe. This is evident in two people who are going to do influential works. Joseph Conrad, who's a British writer, he travels to the Congo, which is the most brutal colonial European colony in all of Africa. It's controlled by the Dutch under King Leopold. I'm sorry, the Belgium. It's controlled under Belgium, who is controlled by King Leopold, and he is controlling Congo because that's where a lot of the rubber comes from, and the treatment of the indigenous people in the Congo is one of the greatest examples of horrific, atrocious, inhuman treatment of one group of people by another in all of human history. Things like, cutting off limbs for even basic perceived offenses. And he's going to witness all this firsthand, and he's going to write a book called The Heart of Darkness, which is a fictional representation of the atrocities being committed in the Congo. It's going to spread through Europe and get a lot of traction and kind of turn a lot of people against imperialism. The other guy that we have is J.A. Hobson. He's an economist who writes a paper pointing out that imperialism is actually a really stupid European economic idea because Europe is building its economy completely around these colonial and imperialistic markets, which are very unstable. And so, if something changes and there's a seismic shift, your economy can collapse. Obviously, imperialism has a number of effects on the indigenous peoples that it's imperializing. An example of this is, the wealth is basically siphoned out of these places to Europe, right? And that's going to create lasting impacts for a lot of these places that still experienced even today, right? But there's also the forced assimilation of indigenous people by their European imperial powers, right? We're going to force indigenous people to go to European schools and adopt European culture. And that has a number of different second and third tier effects. One example is India, which is a British colony under the control of the British East India Company, who employs an army to control the area that's comprised of both British citizens and Indian conscripts, which are called sepoy. The sepoy eventually rebel against the British says government, but it should say East India Company in response to perceived acts of racism and discrimination. And that becomes known as the Sepoy Mutiny. Now, this is important because one, it's an example of the indigenous response to imperialism, but it's also important to this story because the Sepoy Mutiny directly results in the British East India Company advocating control over, giving up control of India and giving it to the British government directly. So as a result of the Sepoy Mutiny, Great Britain will take full governmental control of the Indian colony. All right, we're going to stop there today.